Welcome to Late Night Calm. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, nothing you need to solve, no decision waiting on the far side of the next hour. Just a quiet voice and a long, slow walk through a world that vanished a very long time ago. So let the room go soft around you, let the light be low, and let me take you somewhere old. Imagine for a moment that your entire place in the world could be written down as a single number. Not your name, not your face, not the things you believe or the people you love. A number, a sum of silver coins, counted out and recorded by the state, kept in a ledger, and checked again every 5 years to see whether it had grown or shrunk. And imagine that this number decided everything: where you sat at the games, what you were allowed to wear, whether your vote was counted first with the men who mattered or last when the matter had already been settled, whether you were, in the eyes of the law, a person at all. That is not a thought experiment. That was Rome. Because in ancient Rome, your exact place in society really was a number, a valuation in sesterces, the silver coin that ran through Roman life the way money runs through ours, assessed by officials, written into a register, and reassessed, ideally, every 5 years. Your rank was not a feeling, it was not even, in the end, your bloodline. It was a figure, and that figure could move. The Romans called this great state count the census, and they traced it back, in their own storytelling, to one of their early kings, a man named Servius Tullius, who lived, if he lived at all, in the deep mist of the 6th century, before our era, before Rome was an empire, before it was even much of a city. According to the Romans themselves, it was Servius Tullius who first sorted the people of Rome by their wealth, who said, in effect, you, with this much property, belong here. You, with less, belong there. And you, with almost nothing, we will deal with you separately. This is the thread I want to follow tonight, slowly all the way up, because once you see that rank in Rome was a number, the whole familiar picture starts to come apart in your hands. You have probably seen the picture, the neat little pyramid, patricians at the top in their fine robes, slaves at the very bottom, a few layers in between stacked like bricks, fixed, permanent, the way the pyramids in Egypt are fixed. It is a tidy picture. It is the one most people carry around in their heads, and it is wrong, or at least it is far too still. Because the real thing was not a stone pyramid at all. It was something more like a slow, churning marketplace of status, where positions were bought and lost, where a freed slave's son could stand higher than a freeborn farmer, where the proudest old families could slide quietly toward ruin while men born into chains climbed toward fortunes. It moved. And the engine of all that movement was, at its heart, that number in the ledger. Here is the strangest part, the one I want to leave hanging over the whole of tonight's journey like a lamp at the far end of a long corridor. At the very top of all of this, above the slaves, above the freedmen, above the common citizens and the businessmen and the great landed senators, sat one man, the most powerful human being in the known world. And even he, in the careful fiction of the system, was just another rung on the same ladder. He insisted he was not a king. He called himself, of all things, simply the first citizen. By the time we reach him much later tonight, you will understand exactly why he had to pretend, but that is the far end of the corridor. Hold it in mind, we will get there. Before we go any further into this old lamplit world, let me ask you something, just quietly, as one set of wandering minds to another. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Whatever the hour is where you are, whatever the weather is doing outside your window, I find it strangely comforting to imagine all of us drifting off to the same slow story in so many different rooms, in so many different countries. And if you are new here, and you would like more of these long, calm journeys into the deep past, you might quietly subscribe so they can find their way back to you on the nights you need them. Now, let me make you a promise about the shape of the next few hours. We are going to climb this ladder together, one rung at a time, from the very bottom to the very top. We will begin with the person who, in Roman law, was not a person, the slave. Then we will meet the freed slave, walking out into a citizenship he was born without. We will sit among the common citizens lining up for free bread. We will visit the businessmen with their gold rings and the great senators with their endless fields, and the morning ritual where thousands of free men stood at another man's door to be handed a small basket. We will see exactly how that number in the ledger fixed each of them in place, and we will see how it let them move, and then at the end, the man at the apex. You do not have to stay awake for all of it. That is the whole point. Let your attention loose and let it drift. If you fall asleep somewhere among the slaves or among the senators, or just as the emperor declines his crown, that is exactly right. The story will keep going soft and steady, and you will not have missed anything you needed. There is no test at the end. There is only the slow, warm accumulation of a vanished world, settling over you like a heavy blanket. So, to the bottom of the ladder, picture a person, a man, let us say, though it could as easily be a woman or a child, standing in a household in Rome. He eats, he sleeps, he works. He has hopes, surely, and fears, and a body that aches at the end of the day like any body, and yet, in the eyes of Roman law, he is not a person, he is a thing. That is not poetry, it is the literal legal category. The Romans called the slave servus, and in their law he was classified as res, a thing, an object, property, not a citizen with reduced rights, not a person under some lesser protection, property. In the great compilations of Roman law, the kind of dry legal texts that would later be gathered into Justinian's Digest and the teaching handbook of the jurist Gaius, known as his Institutes, the enslaved human being sits in the same broad category as livestock and land. A slave could be bought, a slave could be sold, a slave could be handed down in a will, like a farm or a piece of furniture or a herd of goats. He had no legal will of his own, no standing to bring a case, no name that the law had to honor. And because he was a thing and not a person, he could not, in law, marry. Two enslaved people might love each other deeply. They might live together for decades, raise children, build something that felt for all the world like a marriage. But the law gave it no name and no weight. It called their union contubernum, which simply means a kind of tent-sharing, a cohabitation, an informal arrangement with no legal standing whatsoever. A real Roman marriage with all its rights and protections was something only persons could have. And the slave was not a person. I want you to sit with how total that is, but gently, the way you would consider something terrible from a great distance through warm glass, because the rest of tonight's climb only means something against this floor. Everyone else we meet, the freedman, the citizen, the businessman, the senator, is, in some sense, defined by not being this, by having a self the law would recognize. The whole glittering ladder rises up out of this single, dark fact at the bottom, that a human being could be, in law, a thing. How many such people were there? Here we have to be honest and a little careful, because the Romans did not leave us a tidy spreadsheet. Historians who study these numbers, and the most careful of them, like the modern scholar Walter Scheidel, build their estimates from population modeling rather than from any Roman head count. generally suggest that enslaved people made up somewhere around 10 to 20% of the population of Italy in the early years of the empire. Some estimates put the enslaved population of Italy alone at perhaps 1 to 1.5 million people around the time of the Emperor Augustus, out of a total of maybe 6 or 7 million. These are estimates debated among scholars, soft at the edges. But even the cautious version tells you something. Enslaved people were not a rare presence in this world. They were woven through every level of it, in vast numbers, holding the whole structure up from underneath. And yet, here is the first turn in the path, the first place where the still pyramid begins to move. Even at the very bottom, the Roman system left a small, strange door open. A crack of light. A slave could have money, not officially his own, you understand? In the cold logic of the law, a thing cannot own things, but Roman custom allowed something called a peculium. The peculium was a fund, coins, sometimes property, sometimes a little business, that a slave was permitted to accumulate and manage with his master's permission. Technically, legally, it still belonged to the master. If you read the legal sources, the ones gathered under headings like Digest 15.1, you find them working out in careful detail exactly who owns what when a slave runs a shop with this fund. But in practice, the peculium was the enslaved person's savings account, his private hoard set aside coin by coin, year by year. And what was that hoard for? What does a man save toward when he owns nothing, not even himself? He saves to buy himself back. This is the thing that sets Roman slavery apart from so many other systems in the ancient world, and I want to walk through it slowly because it is the first great mechanism of movement in this whole society. The act of freeing a slave had a name, manumission, from Latin words meaning, beautifully, the sending away from the hand, the releasing from the grip of ownership. And it was not a single vague gesture. The Romans, who loved their legal forms the way some people love ritual, had several distinct ways to do it. The first, and in some ways the most theatrical, was called manumissio vindicta. It was a kind of staged legal ceremony performed before a magistrate. A rod, the vindicta, was brought out. And in the formal play acting of the rite, the rod was touched to the slave's head, and words were spoken. And in that moment, with that touch, the thing became a person. Imagine it, a man who had owned nothing, not so much as the body he stood in, feeling the light touch of a wooden rod on his head before an official of Rome, and rising from it free. The second form was quieter, more bureaucratic, and it ties straight back to our great theme of the number in the ledger. It was called manumissio censu, freedom by census. To free a slave this way, the master simply had him registered in the census as a citizen. No rod, no ceremony in the courtroom sense, just an entry in the great state register that decided everyone's place. The slave's name went into the count not as property, but as a Roman. The ledger, which fixed your rank, could also remake it. It could turn a thing into a citizen with a stroke. And the third form was the gift of a dying man, manumissio testamento, freedom granted in a will. A master, writing out the disposal of his property at the end of his life, could declare that this slave, or that one, was to be set free upon his death, so that the same document that handed estates to sons and silver to daughters could, in the same breath, lift a human being out of the category of property entirely. People did this. The wills survive in the legal record, the freeings tucked among the bequests, and what came of it when the rod touched the head or the name went into the census or the will was read aloud, something that again set Rome apart from nearly every other slaveholding society of the ancient world. The freed slave under these formal manumissions did not become some halfway thing, some perpetual underclass. He became a Roman citizen, not a full one, as we will see. There were stains and limits that followed him to his grave. But a citizen nonetheless, with a citizen's most basic protections, and his children, and this is the part I find quietly astonishing, his children, if they were born after his freeing, were born completely free, freeborn. The Romans had a word for that too, because the Romans had a word for everything. Ingenui, the freeborn, a child born to a freed slave, carried no legal mark of his father's bondage at all. In the eyes of the law, he stood as clean and free as the son of any senator. One generation, that was the distance, in law, between a thing and a freeborn Roman citizen. One single generation. There was even a little badge for the newly freed, a small, soft thing you could hold in your hand, a felt cap called the pileus. The freed slave wore it as a visible sign of his new liberty, a cap that announced to anyone who looked, this man was bound, and now he is free. It is a humble object, a simple peaked cap of felt, and yet it carried so much meaning that many centuries later, long after Rome itself was dust, that same liberty cap would be picked up again as a symbol of freedom in the great revolutions of the modern age. A small felt cap from the head of a Roman ex-slave echoing down the centuries. Now, here is where the path turns sharply and the still pyramid begins to spin in a way that catches almost everyone by surprise. Because you might imagine that Rome, having built this strange and merciful door out of slavery, would have flung it wide. That the natural arc of such a society would be toward freeing more and more people. Instead, Rome passed laws to slow it down. Let me say that again because it is one of those facts that quietly rearranges the whole picture. Under the Emperor Augustus, the very first emperor, the man we will meet at the summit of tonight's climb, the Roman state passed legislation specifically designed to restrict the freeing of slaves. Manumission had become so common, so frequent, that the authorities moved to put brakes on it. There were two great laws. The first, passed in the year 2 before our era, was called the Lex Caninia, and what it did was cap the number of slaves a master could free in his will. Not free them as he pleased, capped on a sliding scale tied to how many he owned. A man with 100 slaves, for instance, could free no more than a quarter of them by his will. The law set ceilings deliberately on this generosity of the deathbed, precisely because so many masters were writing freedom into their wills that the Roman authorities grew uneasy about the flood of new citizens it produced. The second law came a few years later, in the 4th year of our era, and it was called the Lex Sentia. This one set ages. A slave under this law generally had to be at least 30 years old to be formally freed into full citizenship, and the master doing the freeing had to be at least 20. Conditions, thresholds, minimum ages written into the law of the state governing when this door could be opened. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment here in the dark. A society built on slavery, which we so often imagine as simply flatly cruel. And yet a society whose lawmakers looked at how readily slaves were being turned into citizens and decided they had to legislate to slow it down. Why? Why would Rome want to make it harder to free people? The answer takes us into the very anxieties of Roman society, into questions of who counted as a real Roman, who could vote, who could receive the privileges of citizenship, who diluted the old stock, and who strengthened it. We will feel those anxieties again and again as we climb. For now, simply hold the contradiction like a smooth stone in your palm, that the same Rome which let a man buy himself out of bondage and made his children freeborn citizens also passed careful laws to keep the door from opening too wide, too fast. The marketplace of status had its gatekeepers. Even the way out was regulated, counted, capped. And I should tell you, before we leave the bottom of the ladder and climb up toward the freedman who has just walked out that door, I should tell you that not all slavery in Rome was the same. The single word service covered an enormous range of lives, from something almost gentle to something simply lethal, and where you landed in that range was, again, a kind of brutal lottery. At one end were the household slaves of the city, what the Romans called the familia urbana, the urban household. And here, in the great houses of Rome, the picture genuinely complicates, because a household slave in a wealthy home might live, in purely material terms, better than a great many free but desperately poor Romans scraping by in the city's slums. Many of these urban slaves were educated, valued, even cherished for their skills. Greek slaves in particular were prized. A cultured Greek captive might serve as a pedagogus, a tutor to the master's children, the man who walked the boys to school and shaped their early minds. Others served as secretaries, managing their master's correspondence and accounts. Some were doctors. Some were skilled accountants who ran the financial affairs of an entire estate. These were people in chains, yes, with no legal self-titled, but warm, fed, sheltered, sometimes deeply trusted, holding in their hands the education and the ledgers of the rich. And at the other end of that same word, service, was something with no comfort in it at all. The familia rustica, the slaves of the countryside, and below even them, the slaves of the mines. Here we leave the warm atrium and the tutored children entirely. These were the men and women worked on the great agricultural estates, and worst of all, sent down into the mines where conditions were brutal, exhausting, and very often simply fatal. There was no Greek poetry here, no trusted account-keeping. There was labor that consumed the body and discarded it. The gulf between the educated tutor in the townhouse and the broken figure in the mineshaft was as wide as any gulf in this whole society. And yet the law gave them the same name, the same nothing status, the same single word, thing. We can hear how the Romans themselves could think about these people in the writings of a famous old statesman called Cato the Elder in his handbook on running a farm. And I tell you this not to endorse it. Let me be very clear, this is a window into a mentality, not a moral fact, but because it shows you more sharply than any modern summary could how the cold logic of property could play out. Cato advised the careful farm owner to sell off his old and sick slaves, the worn-out ones, the way you would sell off worn-out tools or aging oxen. Use them up, dispose of them when they no longer serve. It is a chilling line, even at this distance of 2,000 years, and it sits right alongside the merciful door of manumission, the felt cap, the freeborn children. All of it inside the same society, the same law, the same single rung at the bottom of the ladder. That is the flaw then, the thing that is not a person, the savings hoard scraped together toward the price of a self, the rod touched to the head, the name written into the census, the freedom folded into a will, the felt cap, the freeborn child, and the laws passed to slow it all down. The tutor in the warm house and the figure broken in the mine, sharing one cold word between them, and rising up out of all of it, having just walked through that door with the felt cap still new upon his head. The freedman. The man who was a thing yesterday and is a citizen today, but a citizen with a shadow on him, a stain the law itself names, and a string of obligations tying him still to the master he has only half left behind. Let me show you his life next. Let me show you what it cost and what it bought to climb that very first rung, and why, for all the limits laid on him, his children would rise into a Rome that had entirely forgotten he was ever owned at all. But before we follow him up, let me take you back down to the floor one more time, slowly, because there is a number underneath all of this that we have not yet touched, and it is the number that holds the whole ladder together. Imagine a great roll of records kept by the Roman state. Not a story, not a chronicle of battles, but something far quieter and far more powerful. A ledger of people and what they were worth. This was the census, and the Romans believed it had been founded by one of their early kings, Servius Tullius, far back in the dim beginnings of the city. The idea was simple and merciless. Every 5 years, the censors would count the citizens, not just count their heads, but count their property, weigh their wealth, and write down beside each name the exact sum the man was worth. And that sum, recorded in sesterces, the silver coin of Rome, was your rank. Not your blood, not your ancestors. The number. Listen to how strange and how modern that is. Your place in Roman society was a valuation, the way a house or a field is valued, and it was reassessed on a schedule. Every 5 years, the question was asked again, what are you worth now? And depending on the answer, you might be sorted into one property class or another, assigned your tax, assigned your military duty, and, most striking of all, assigned your voting weight in the Great Assembly called the Comitia Centuriata. In that assembly, the wealthiest citizens were grouped into centuries that voted first and held the majority, so that the richest men of Rome could settle a matter before the poorest ever opened their mouths. A democracy of a kind, with the scales tipped openly and lawfully toward those who had the most. The Romans did not hide this, they built it into the architecture of the vote. At the very bottom of that count were people too poor to be measured by property at all. The proletarii, whose only wealth was reckoned to be their children, proles, offspring. And below or beside them, the capite censi, the ones simply counted by the head, because there was nothing else to count. From that lowest, propertyless rung comes a word you still use today without thinking: proletariat. The poorest free Romans gave their name to the working masses of every age that followed, and when the long counting was done, when every name had its number, the censors closed the whole ceremony with a ritual of purification called a lustrum. The word meant that rite of cleansing performed once every 5 years at the count's end, and so the word came to mean the 5-year span itself. A lustrum, a neat unit of time measured out by the rhythm of the state weighing its people. You can almost feel the slowness of it, the great calm machinery turning over once every 5 years, asking the same patient question of every citizen alive. Hold on to that picture, because everything we walk through tonight hangs from it. A slave is below the count entirely, a thing, not even a name on the roll. A freedman steps onto the very bottom of it, and far above there are thresholds drawn across this same ledger in lines of silver. A sum that makes you a knight, a larger sum that makes you a senator. The whole vertical world of Rome is one ledger, read at different heights. Welcome to Late Night Calm. Before we climb any higher, let yourself settle in. If you are drifting off somewhere in the world tonight, I would quietly love to know where. Leave a word in the comments whenever you wake, telling me what country, what city, what dark window you are listening from. And if these slow journeys into the old world help you find your way down into sleep, you might stay a while. There are more of them here, waiting in the same unhurried voice. There is nothing for you to do now but lie still and let the city of Rome assemble itself around you, rank by rank, from the cold floor to the gilded apex. And let me carry you up it slowly, one rung at a time. Now, back to that floor, and the strange word, the law, used for the human beings who stood on it. A slave in Roman law was not a who, he was a what, servus, and the lawyers placed him not among persons but among things, among res, the same legal category as a plough, a field, a head of cattle. He could be bought, he could be sold, he could be handed down in a will like a set of silver cups. He could be valued the way the census valued free men, except that his value was not his rank, it was simply his price, because he belonged, body and breath, to someone else. And because he was a thing and not a person, the law would not let him do the most ordinary human things in any way it recognized. He could not marry. Two slaves who loved each other, who lived together, who raised children together, were not, in the eyes of Rome, married at all. Their bond had a name, contubernium, a word that means little more than sharing a tent, the same word a soldier used for the men he bunked beside. A tent sharing. The law would grant their union no more standing than that. A master could sell one of them tomorrow to anyone, anywhere, and the law would record no wrong because nothing that the law called a marriage had been broken. And yet, even a thing, it turned out, could be allowed to hold something. Here is one of the quiet miracles of the Roman system, the small door at the bottom of the wall. A slave could be permitted by his master to build up a fund of his own, money, goods, sometimes even other slaves of his own. And this fund had a name, the peculium. In strict law, it still belonged to the master. It was the master's property held in the slave's hands. But in practice, it was the slave's own hoard, his savings, the coins set aside from tips and side work and careful trade, kept in some hidden corner and counted in the dark. And what was that hoard for? It was for the most extraordinary purchase a human being could ever make. With his peculium scraped together over years, a slave could buy the one thing he did not own, himself. He could hand his own price across to his master and walk out the other side a free man. The savings of a thing spent to become a person. There is no stranger transaction in all of Roman law, and thousands of people across the centuries made it, coin by patient coin. But freedom, when it came, was not a clean slate. It never quite was. The Roman system had a word for what you became the moment the rod touched your head, or your name was written into the census. Libertus, if you were a man, liberta, if a woman. And that word, for all the remarkable transformation it described, carried within it an invisible shadow that followed you for the rest of your life. The shadow even had a name. The macula servitutis, the stain of slavery. Not a mark on the skin, not a brand, though some slaves did bear those. This stain was legal and social, written into how others saw you and what the state would allow you to do. You were a citizen now. You held the extraordinary prize that Roman citizenship represented, the right to make legal contracts, to own property in your own name, to stand before a court as a person rather than as an object. And yet two doors, among all the doors that citizenship was supposed to open, remained closed to you for the rest of your natural life. You could not hold a magistracy. The offices of the cursus honorum, the whole ladder of public service that free-born men climbed, rung by careful rung, as the path to power and prestige, those were not for you. You could not stand for election as quaestor or aedile or praetor or consul. You could not sit in the Senate. These were the particular preserves of the freeborn, the ingenui, and the stain of slavery meant that no ceremony, however formal, no document, however official, could wash that away in your own lifetime. And there was the other door, the legions. A Roman soldier had to be a freeborn citizen, and that requirement was taken seriously enough that the macula kept freedmen out of the regular army. You might be a citizen, you might pay taxes, You might walk the same streets and drink in the same taverns, but you could not take up the standard of a Roman legion and march under it as a soldier in the ordinary way. These were real restrictions, and they mattered. But here is the thing about Rome that makes it so different from what we might expect. Here is the quiet revolution hidden inside the system. Your son carried none of it. If you were freed while still young enough to have children after your manumission, those children were born to a free man or free woman. They were ingenui, free-born. The stain did not. In a single generation, the mark that followed you across all your years was simply gone, and the son of a freed slave stood legally equal to the son of any other free-born Roman citizen. He could stand for election, he could join the legions, he could climb any rung on any ladder the Roman world offered. The census would look at him and see only what he owned, not who his father had been. This was not an accident, it was a design. Rome understood that the promise of freedom had to be real enough to motivate compliance, to give the enslaved something to work toward, to make the peculium worth accumulating and the decades of service worth bearing. And the extension of that promise to the next generation made it sharper still. You might not live to see every door open, but you could give that to a child. So what did you owe for all of this? What did the system expect in return? You owed your former master. In becoming free, you did not walk away from him cleanly. You walked away from the legal category of slave and directly into a new category, his client, his freedman. And the relationship between a freedman and his former master, now his patronus, was formalized and obligatory in ways that bound you almost as tightly as the old chain, though differently. The freedmen owed their patron obsequium. The word translates roughly as deference or respectful compliance. The expectation that you would treat your former master with the honor due to a superior, that you would not publicly insult him, not take him to court on a mere pretext, not behave in ways that made him look bad. It was the legal requirement that you would not forget what you had been and who had freed you. And then there were the operae, the days of labor. When a slave was formally freed, it was common practice for the terms of his manumission to include a negotiated number of days per year during which he owed the patron his working hours. This was not slavery revisited. He was a citizen, he was free, and outside those days he was his own man. But it meant that a craftsman who had been freed might owe his old master 40 or 60 days of skilled work per year, unpaid, as part of the price of freedom. A physician, a secretary, a skilled tradesman, their years of professional expertise did not become entirely their own on the day the rod touched their head. A portion of it still belonged, by agreement and by law, to the man who had freed them. The Digest, the great compilation of Roman legal opinion gathered under the Emperor Justinian centuries later, dedicated an entire section to exactly this: the obligations that bound the freedman to his patron, the operae owed, the conditions under which they could be reduced or contested. There were lawyers who made careers out of litigating the precise dimensions of a freedman's duties. That these disputes existed at all tells you something. It tells you the bond between freed man and former master was dense enough, complicated enough, that it required a body of law to manage. And the bond did not end at death, not the patron's death nor the freedman's. If a freedman died without children, his estate did not pass to whoever he wished it to. Roman law gave the patron inheritance rights over a childless freedman's property, reaching down even through the grave to assert the old relationship one final time. Digest 38.2 is precise on this. The tie that was made at manumission was made for life, and in some ways beyond it. You could even see the relationship in a person's name if you knew how to read it. A free-born Roman citizen of any standing carried his tria nomina, his three names, a praenomen, the personal name, given at birth, a nomen, the family name, the great clan identifier that told the world which bloodline you came from, and a cognomen, the third name, sometimes a family branch, sometimes a nickname that had calcified across generations into something official. Three names, the badge of free Roman birth. A freedman had three names too, but his nomen, his middle name, the clan name, was his former master's. This was not a choice and not a coincidence. It was the record of the transaction, carried in the body of every introduction, every inscription, every legal document the freedman ever produced. If your master was Marcus Tullius Cicero and he freed you, you became Marcus Tullius something, the great orator's own family name, now sitting in the middle of your name, telling everyone you met that you had once belonged to him. The name was the deed. The name was the archive of your origin, and you wore it every day of your free life, as inescapable as the macula itself. And yet the freedmen of Rome were not a class defined by shame. They were in many cases defined by something closer to its opposite. Walk into any collection of Roman inscriptions, the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, the great modern compilation of every carved stone, every funerary plaque, every bronze tablet that has survived from across the Roman world, and one of the things you encounter with remarkable frequency is the tombstone of a freedman or a freedwoman who wanted the world to know exactly what they had achieved, not hiding the origin, announcing it. These inscriptions name the patron, name the trade, name the family built after freedom, record the money made and the things given to the community. There is pride in them, a very particular kind of pride that belongs to a person who began with nothing, who was legally nothing, and made something real because there was real making to be done. The macula closed the doors of political office, but it did not close the doors of commerce. And commerce in Rome could take a freed slave to heights that would make the old freeborn farmer who still worked his 3-acre plot look up in something between envy and bewilderment. Petronius understood this and he wrote about it, and the character he created to embody it has not been forgotten in 2,000 years, Trimalchio. The fictional creation at the center of Petronius's Satyricon, a text written in the reign of Nero, probably in the middle of the 1st century of our era, Trimalchio is a former slave made absurdly, grotesquely, almost cosmically rich, a man who throws banquets of such insane extravagance that the guests can barely keep track of what is being put in front of them, who has servants for his servants, who decorates his walls with scenes from his own life story, including the moment of his manumission, who reads out his own will at dinner because he wants to hear the guests weep. He is a figure of satire. Petronius is not celebrating him. Petronius is laughing at him in the way that the old aristocracy always laughed at new money, at the vulgarity, the excess, the desperate overperformance of someone who has arrived at wealth without arriving at taste. But the most important thing about the laughter is what it requires to function. It requires Trimalchio to be real. The joke only works if the audience recognizes the type. If freed slaves who made enormous fortunes had not actually existed, Petronius's satire would have had no teeth. Trimalchio is a comic exaggeration, but he is the comic exaggeration of something Rome lived with and could not quite decide how to feel about. And then there were the ones who were not fictional at all. Under the Emperor Claudius, who ruled from AD 41 to AD 54, two men stood near the very heart of Roman power. Their names were Narcissus and Pallas. They were freedmen, Liberti Augusti, freedmen of the imperial household itself. and they had risen through the administrative machinery of the emperor's personal staff to positions of such practical influence that senators, men of ancient family and million sesterce fortunes, were forced to court them and defer to them and sometimes bribe them. Narcissus controlled the imperial correspondence. In an empire that ran on written communication, on letters sent to governors and generals and client kings across a territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, the man who filtered and composed and dispatched the emperor's correspondence was a man of extraordinary practical power. Pallas was even more consequential. He was, in effect, the chief financial officer of the empire, the man through whose hands the accounts of the world's largest state passed. Tacitus, who wrote about these men with the barely concealed fury of a senator who believed that power should not sit in the hands of men who had once been property, records that Pallas was worth 300 million sesterces, 300 million. Try to hold that number against the soldiers' pay for a moment. A legionary under Augustus earned 900 sesterces a year. At that rate, a soldier would need to work for 330,000 years to accumulate what Pallas had gathered in one lifetime of administrative service. It is not a number that maps onto human experience easily. It represents something beyond ordinary wealth and into the territory of almost incomprehensible accumulation. And these men were freedmen. They were citizens of the second stripe, carrying the macula, unable to hold a magistracy, unable technically to stand in the Senate as members, and yet Tacitus makes clear that senators came to them. The doors of office were closed, and it turned out not to matter very much when the man behind the closed door controlled everything that moved through it. But there was another door open to the freedman, one more respectable than raw commerce and more accessible than the magistracies. In the towns and smaller cities of Italy and across the provinces, the cult of the imperial family, the worship of the divine aspects of the emperor and of Rome's sacred rulers, was organized through a priesthood called the Augustales. And the Augustales were, very deliberately and openly, a space made for freedmen. This was not a consolation prize exactly. The Augustales carried genuine prestige in their communities. A freedman who became an Augustales held a recognized public role, attended at public ceremonies, made dedications in the name of the city, and often funded public works and festivals from his own fortune, the kind of visible generosity that brought respect and memory in a Roman town. The tombstones of Augustales survive in remarkable numbers precisely because these were men who could afford good stone and wanted to be remembered. They are spread across Italy and into Spain and Africa and the eastern provinces, each one a small record of a man who had made something of himself in the only formal public role the system would grant him. The world of the freed slave was not then a world of permanent degradation. It was a world of constrained possibility. Specific doors locked, others deliberately left open, the next generation carrying none of the weight. It was a complicated position, woven through with old obligations and new opportunities, its geography defined by the peculiar Roman combination of cruelty and pragmatism. You could be a freedman and be one of the wealthiest men in the empire. You could be a freedman and hold real power over men who would not have looked at you when you were property. You could be a freedman and build a family whose grandchildren would remember you, if they remembered you at all, simply as the founder of something. And below the freedman, or alongside him really, in a way that cuts against every simple picture of the Roman social order, stood the free-born plebeian citizen, carrying no stain, no macula, no former master's name in the middle of his own, born free. And quite possibly, if your imagination has built the standard pyramid, much poorer and lower and more disadvantaged than the successful Libertus who lived next door. Here is the moment to dismantle something. When people hear the word plebeian, they hear something small. They hear the opposite of aristocrat. They picture the masses at the bottom of the pyramid, the hungry crowd in the circus, the people who needed the free bread. The word has entered the language in that shape. Plebeian still means common, ordinary, low, when English borrows it to describe someone without refinement. But in the legal architecture of Rome, plebeian did not mean poor. It was not an economic description at all. It was a hereditary category with no necessary relationship to wealth. To understand what it actually meant, you have to go back to a struggle so old that it preceded the Rome of emperors and legions, the Rome of marble and engineering wonders. The conflict of the orders, it is called, a slow constitutional crisis that unfolded over roughly 2 centuries, from around 494 BC to 287 BC, between the 2 hereditary groups that divided all Roman citizens, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the old families, the ancient clans whose ancestors, by tradition, had sat in the first senate of the first kings, whose blood was the blood of Rome's founding. They held the religious and political privileges, certain priesthoods, certain magistracies, the right to take the auspices, the birds and signs rituals that certified divine approval for any important Roman action. They were not simply richer, they were the custodians of a sacred lineage that non-patricians could not claim regardless of how much silver they owned. The plebeians were everyone else, all the free-born citizens who were not of those ancient families. And from the beginning of the Republic, the plebeians included within their number people of wildly varying means. Small farmers and landless poor, yes, but also families of significant wealth and local power who happened not to carry a patrician name. The conflict between these groups played out across generations, and its resolution was the foundation of what Rome eventually became. The plebeians organized themselves, created their own assembly, their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, the tribuni plebis, with their famous power of the veto, the intercessio, that could halt the action of any Roman magistrate. They withdrew from the city collectively more than once. The famous secessio plebis, sitting on a hill outside Rome and refusing to participate in civic life until their grievances were addressed. By 287 BC, the struggle was effectively over. The Lex Hortensia, passed in that year, gave the resolutions of the plebeian assembly, the plebiscita, the force of law binding on all Romans, patricians included. Every magistracy was open to plebeians. The great religious offices fell to them too in time. The distinction remained on paper and in social memory, but the practical disabilities of being plebeian had been removed. And this meant that by the last centuries of the Republic, by the time of Julius Caesar and Cicero and Augustus, the patrician, our plebeian distinction, had become, in most practical senses, ceremonial. A matter of lineage and tradition and the particular ritual functions still attached to patrician families, not a map of power or wealth. Consider the Caecilii Metelli, one of the great plebeian families of the late Republic, not patrician, born of plebeian stock going back centuries. They held consulships, priesthoods, military commands, provincial governorships, the full range of what Roman public life had to offer its most powerful members. They were spectacularly wealthy and politically dominant across generations. If someone had told a member of the Caecilii Metelli that he was simply a plebeian of the lower order, of the common sort, the offense would have been considerable. So the word plebeian by itself told you almost nothing about where someone stood in the real economy of Roman power and wealth. It told you one thing only, that their family had not been among the original senatorial clans of Rome's earliest days. That was it. The rest was up to the census. But the freeborn plebeian citizen, wherever he stood on the economic ladder, did hold one thing that the freedman did not. He held it from birth, with no obligation attached, with no former master's name recorded in his own. He held full citizenship. Unencumbered citizenship, citizenship that carried no stain, no shadow, no opry owed to anyone. And the Roman state had decided at a specific moment in history to make one expression of that citizenship take a very concrete form: bread. In 123 BC, the tribune Gaius Gracchus, one of two brothers whose careers and violent ends mark one of the most turbulent passages of the late Republic, pushed through the Lex Sempronia Frumentaria. The law was not entirely novel, but Gracchus made it systematic in a new way. The Roman state would sell grain to citizens at a subsidized price, below what the market charged. Not free, not yet, but cheaper than it should be by state intervention as a right of citizenship. This was already a remarkable thing, the Roman state reaching into the grain markets of the Mediterranean, buying in bulk, storing, distributing, making the bread cheaper for the people of Rome, because the people of Rome were citizens, and citizens deserved something from their city that non-citizens did not receive. The grain dole, the annona, the frumentatio, had begun. Then, 65 years later, in 58 BC, a tribune named Clodius took the next step, the Lex Clodia Frumentaria. He removed the price entirely. The grain was now free, zero cost. The Roman citizen would simply collect his allocation and pay nothing. The political calculation behind this is not subtle. Clodius was a populist, a man who had crossed from the patrician class into the plebeian tribuneship precisely to wield this kind of power, and giving the Roman people free grain was one of the most effective political acts in the city's history. It was also enormously expensive, and someone had to pay. The revenues of an expanding empire, the taxes of provinces, the wealth extracted from the world Rome had conquered, flowing back to this city in the form of grain handed to citizens who had not worked for it. By the time of Augustus, the machinery of the dole was enormous and formalized. Historians estimate that around 200,000 male citizens of Rome, 200,000, received the free grain distribution. The number is a scholarly estimate, but it gives a sense of the scale. Nearly 250,000 people in a single city receiving a monthly allocation of grain as a matter of right. To be on the list of the plebs frumentaria, the grain-receiving citizenry, you held a tessera, a token, a small thing made of wood or terracotta, or sometimes lead, inscribed and issued by the state, that entitled you to show up on the right day of the month and collect your portion. The tessera was your proof of eligibility. It was, in its small material way, a citizenship card, and it conferred a privilege that no non-citizen could touch. The monthly allocation was 5 modii of wheat. A modius is a unit of dry measure, roughly the equivalent of about 6.5 litres, or a little under a peck in Old English measure. 5 of them comes to approximately 33 kilograms, or around 73 pounds, of wheat per month. Not pre-ground flour. Grain. The recipient would take it home, or to a mill, and have it ground and baked, or cook it himself. Was this enough to live on, roughly, for one person, for a month, or nearly? For a family, it was supplemental, one cornerstone of a diet, not its whole content. The historians who have modelled the economics of the dole generally conclude that 5 modii fed a man, but not his whole household. He needed other sources of income or food for the rest of his family. But the grain was reliably there, every month, free. In a world where food security was the defining anxiety of most people's lives, where a bad harvest could mean genuine famine, there was something profound about that reliability. And the grain dole kept changing shape across the centuries. Under the Emperor Aurelian, in the 3rd century AD, the distribution shifted from raw grain to something more processed. The state began distributing baked bread instead of wheat berries, and added alongside it rations of pork, oil, and wine. The Roman state had become, in a sense, a vast bakery and commissary, producing and distributing not just the raw material of a meal, but the meal itself in something close to finished form. Juvenal, the poet who wrote his satires, probably in the late 1st and early 2nd century of our era, looked at all of this and made it famous in 2 words, panem et circenses. Bread and circuses. He was not celebrating the arrangement. He was lamenting it with the particular bitterness of a man who believed that the Roman people had once been the rulers of their own civic destiny, had voted, had served, had decided the fates of wars and peace, and had traded all of that away for the right to be fed and entertained without effort. The expression has never quite died because the thing it describes has never quite gone away. But the grain dole was not a welfare program aimed at the poor. This is worth saying clearly because it is one of the most common misunderstandings. The tessera was a citizenship privilege. A rich citizen who happened to live in Rome and happened to be registered on the plebs frumentaria list could, in principle, collect his 5 modii just as readily as the man who truly needed them. It was not means tested. It was not administered by checking whether you could afford your own food. It was citizenship with a monthly payment attached, and the condition was simply that you were a Roman male citizen on the relevant list and resident in the city. What this means is that the grain dole was doing something more than alleviating poverty, though it did that. It was making a statement about what Rome was, what citizenship meant, what the compact between the city and its people looked like. To be a Roman citizen was, among many other things, to be entitled to a share of what the empire produced. The grain came from Egypt and North Africa, the breadbaskets of the ancient world, shipped across the Mediterranean by a supply system of remarkable complexity, and some of it ended up in the hands of every eligible man in Rome's population by right. Outside the system of the dole, the daily life of the ordinary free Roman in the city was shaped overwhelmingly by the material reality of the insula, the apartment block. The word means, originally, an island, a block bounded by streets, a building that stands alone. And the insulae of Rome were the dominant built environment of the city's non-elite population. Multi-story buildings, some of them rising to 5 or 6 or more floors, with ground-level shops and the better, more spacious apartments on the lower floors, and cheaper, smaller, darker, hotter in summer and colder in winter spaces as you climbed. The upper floors of an insula were the address of the poor. Not metaphorically, there was a direct inverse relationship between floor and status. The higher you lived, the farther you were from the street and from the fountain. Because there was no running water above the ground floor in almost all these buildings, you carried your water up. You also carried fuel for fire because there were no built kitchens in most insular apartments. Cooking, if you did it at all, was done on a small brazier in your room, and the fire risk this created was one of the defining features of life in a Roman city. Fire was a constant. Buildings collapsed. The roof tiles that Juvenal describes falling on pedestrians were not literary exaggeration. What this meant in practice, for the person living on the 4th floor of a Roman insula, was that you did not cook your own hot meals very often. Instead, you went downstairs and you went out into the street and you went to the thermopolium. The thermopolium was the Roman fast food counter. The name means, roughly, a place that sells hot things. And the archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Ostia, 2 cities preserved well enough to give us detailed pictures of how Romans actually lived, shows that there were thermopolia everywhere, on every block, at every corner. The typical layout was an L-shaped masonry counter built into the street-facing wall with large ceramic jars called dolia set into the counter and partially sunk below its surface, and in those jars, kept warm by the thermal mass of the surrounding masonry, the food, olives, lentils, a stew of some kind, bread, cooked chickpeas, wine if you wanted it, the food of the street bought for a few asses, the smallest denomination of Roman copper coin, and eaten standing at the counter or walking away. This was not a poor man's sad compromise. This was simply how city life worked in ancient Rome. The insulae were not designed for home cooking, the population was dense, the food supply was organized, and the thermopolium met a structural need. You were not eating at a thermopolium because you had failed at life. You were eating there because that was what the city offered, and the city offered it at every turn. The plebeian citizen, then, lived in a world layered with support structures that were genuinely unusual in the ancient world. The dole, the water from the public fountains fed by the aqueducts, the free access to the public baths, the games paid for by the wealthy as acts of political generosity, free water, free grain, subsidized entertainment, cheap hot food on every block. The material baseline was not comfortable by any modern standard, and the upper-floor insular apartment in fire-prone Rome was not anyone's idea of safety. But there was a structure to it. There was a city that recognized its citizens as having claims on it, and there were ways to live within those claims. The person who lived this life, who held the tessera, who knew the right day of the month to collect his modii, who ate his lentils from a dolia jar and lived on the fourth floor and walked to the public fountain every morning, was a free Roman citizen. He carried something that no freedman carried without complication, no slave carried at all. He had been born into it, and in the complex, churning, constantly recalibrated hierarchy of Roman life, that birthright was a foundation. What you built on it depended on the census, on your patron, on your luck, and on the wealth you could accumulate before the next time the censors came around to count. But there were rungs above his. There were always rungs above. And the next one up was defined, as so much in Rome was defined, by a number, 400,000 sesterces. That was the number, not a vague sense of respectability, not a family name that carried weight, not the right ancestors or the right friends alone, though those things mattered too. The number was 400,000 sesterces, written in the census record against your name, and if your wealth reached that threshold and the censors verified it, you became something specific. You became an eques, a member of the equestrian order, and the world treated you differently from that day forward. The word itself, equites, meant horseman, cavalry. The men wealthy enough in the oldest days of Rome to furnish their own horse and armor and ride into battle for the city. The city even provided what was called the public horse, the equus publicus, to those it recognized as belonging to this rank, a symbolic animal that marked you as one of the riding class. By the time of the empire, that original military meaning had faded considerably, folded into ceremony and memory. An equestrian in the age of Augustus or Nero or Marcus Aurelius was not primarily a cavalry officer. He was a businessman, an administrator, a man of affairs, and the public horse had become more emblem than animal, more title than transport. But the name endured as Roman names and titles tended to endure long past their original occasion, carrying the echo of an older Rome inside the sounds of a newer one. And the equestrian order was, in the practical daily life of the city and the empire, something more interesting than cavalry. It was where the money moved. Here is a thing that surprises people who picture Rome as a place where wealth and political power concentrated in the same hands. By law, they were deliberately kept apart. The Lex Claudia, passed in 218 BC, barred senators from owning ships above a certain size. The reasoning was moral and political both. Trade, in the Roman aristocratic imagination, was ungentlemanly, something a man of senatorial dignity should not soil his hands with. You owned land. You drew rents from your estates. You did not haggle over cargo prices in Ostia Harbour or bid on tax collection contracts in the provinces. That was for other men, and those other men were the equestrians, which meant that the equestrian order became, over the centuries of the Republic, and then the empire, the engine room of the Roman economy. The publicani were equestrians. Those were the tax farmers, the men who bid at public auction for the right to collect taxes from a province, paid the Roman state a lump sum up front, and then collected the actual tax revenue themselves, keeping whatever surplus their efficiency or their ruthlessness produced. The risk was real. If the province had a bad year, if the harvest failed or war disrupted trade, you might collect less than you had paid. But if the year was good, the profits could be extraordinary. The publicani were simultaneously essential to how Rome funded itself and universally resented by the provincials who dealt with them. A combination that shows up in the historical record with impressive regularity, and that shows up, less formally, in the fact that tax collector became a term of near universal contempt across the ancient Mediterranean. Beyond the publicani, there were the bankers, the large-scale traders, the men who financed the grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa that kept Rome fed, the men who lent money to senatorial families who found themselves short of liquid cash despite their enormous land holdings. Because land was magnificent in theory and sometimes precarious in practice, a bad harvest on your Campanian estate meant the rent came in low, and if your son was running for praetor next year and needed to fund games, you might need a loan. The equestrian banker was the man you went to. The equestrian order sat in the middle of the economy between the senatorial families above them and the merchant traders and craftsmen below, and they made themselves indispensable to both. On your body, if you were an eques, the world could see what you were. The annulus aureus, the gold ring, was one marker, a ring of gold that only free citizens of equestrian rank had the formal right to wear. And on your tunic ran the angustus clavus, the narrow purple stripe, a vertical band of colour running down the front of the garment from the shoulder. Purple was expensive, extracted from sea snails in a process that was labour-intensive and deeply unpleasant, and the colour itself spoke of cost and standing. The narrow stripe said, "I am above the ordinary citizen." The broad stripe, the latus clavus, worn by senators, said, "I am above you still." The whole social order was embroidered into the fabric of what people wore, visible in the street, readable at a glance. You did not need to know a man's name to know roughly where he stood. You looked at his tunic. Under the empire, and this is where the equestrian story becomes unexpectedly consequential, unexpectedly powerful, the equestrian order stopped being merely the business class and became something closer to the administrative spine of the entire empire. Because Augustus and his successors faced a problem, the Senate was full of men with names, with pride, with ancestral traditions, with the assumption that they were owed high office by their blood and their rank. And managing an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia required administrators who would actually do what the emperor wanted, efficiently, without the political complications that came with senatorial ambition. The solution was the equestrians. Equestrian administrators called procuratores, procurators, ran the finances of provinces all across the empire, collecting revenues, managing imperial estates, overseeing accounts. They answered to the emperor, not to the Senate. Equestrians commanded the fleet. Equestrians commanded the vigiles, the night watch and fire brigade of Rome. Equestrians commanded the grain supply, the praefectus annonae, the prefect of the annona, the office responsible for ensuring that Rome's million-odd inhabitants were fed, which meant overseeing the grain shipments from Egypt, the storage facilities, the distribution system, an operation of logistical complexity that affected the stability of the entire city on a daily basis. If the grain ships were late, Rome grew hungry and then angry. The man responsible for preventing that was an equestrian. And then there was Egypt. Egypt, the wealthiest province in the empire, the source of enormous quantities of grain and enormous tax revenue, was governed not by a senator but by an equestrian prefect and the praefectus Aegypti, the prefect of Egypt. Augustus had established this arrangement deliberately. Egypt was too important to risk giving to a senator who might use its wealth and its legions to challenge imperial power, so an equestrian administered it, answerable directly to the emperor, holding one of the most consequential positions in the Roman world, but holding it as a man who could not, by the ordinary paths of the cursus honorum, aspire to the consulship or the Senate. The job was enormous, the title was equestrian, and at the very summit of what an equestrian could reach, in the empire, was a position that made its holder the second most powerful man in the Roman world, the praetorian prefect. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal military force, the elite soldiers stationed at Rome, was commanded by the praetorian prefect, and that man was always, by convention and by constitutional design, an equestrian, not a senator. Some praetorian prefects were consummate professionals who served loyally for decades. Others accumulated influence that dwarfed that of most senators. Under certain emperors, the praetorian prefect was effectively a co-ruler, the man who decided what the emperor saw and heard, who had access and who did not. The praetorian prefect Sejanus under Tiberius controlled the empire for years while the emperor withdrew to Capri. All of that power in a man defined by the census as equestrian, not senatorial, by 400,000 sesterces, not 1 million. The ladder between the equestrian order and the Senate was real and crossable. The mechanism was called adlectio, imperial adlection, the emperor's power to simply enroll a man in the Senate, to declare him a senator, to elevate him directly. It required that his wealth reach the senatorial threshold, and it required imperial favor, but it happened. Emperors used adlectio to bring talented equestrian administrators into the Senate, to reward loyalty, to reshape the composition of the upper house. A man who had spent his career as a procurator, managing provincial finances with precision and care, might find himself at the emperor's pleasure a senator. His children would be senators' children. The door between the second rank and the first was not sealed. It opened when the emperor decided to open it. 400,000 sesterces below, 1 million above, and the senatorial order was a world of its own. 1 million sesterces. That was the census qualification Augustus set for the senatorial order, and it is worth sitting with that number for a moment, feeling the weight of it. A legionary soldier under Augustus earned around 900 sesterces a year, a rate that itself represented a raise, since Augustus had increased military pay. 900 sesterces a year, which means that 1 million sesterces represented roughly more than 1,000 years of a soldier's wages, not 10 years, not 100 years, 1,000. The threshold for being a senator was a sum that an ordinary soldier, starting at birth, working every day of his life and spending nothing, could not accumulate in a millennium. The thresholds were not merely ambitious benchmarks, they were astronomical. The Senate under Augustus numbered around 600 men. Sulla had swollen it once to around 600, and Caesar had bloated it further to somewhere near 900, filling it with men of questionable distinction. But Augustus had trimmed it back, purged it, reviewed the lists, and settled on something close to 600 as the working number of the body that would govern, advise, debate, and legitimate. 600 families across the whole empire, constituting the highest formal rank of Roman society below the emperor himself. What did their wealth look like? It looked like land, almost entirely like land. Senatorial families owned vast agricultural estates, the latifundia, the great landed properties that spread across the Italian countryside and into the provinces, worked by enslaved laborers on the largest and most profitable holdings, and by colony tenant farmers who paid rent in kind or in cash on others. The land produced grain, wine, olive oil, the foundational commodities of the ancient Mediterranean economy, and it produced rents and it produced income, and all of that was the correct, the dignified, the socially sanctioned form of senatorial wealth. You did not trade, you did not bid for tax contracts, you did not haggle, you were a landowner. Your wealth grew from the soil, which was considered, in the Roman moral imagination, the most honest and honorable form of accumulation, connected to the ancient virtues of the Roman farmer citizen who had supposedly built the republic by working his fields and defending them with his sword. On your body, as a senator, you wore the latus clavus, the broad purple stripe that distinguished you from the equestrian's narrow band. On your feet, the calcae senatori, the senatorial shoes, shoes of a specific cut and color, and the oldest families wore a lunula, a small crescent ornament of ivory, on the strap of the shoe. Even footwear carried rank, and at the theatre, at the gladiatorial games, at the great public spectacles of Rome, senators sat in the orchestra, the front section, the best seats directly below the performance, close enough to see the expressions on the faces of the performers. The seating arrangements at any Roman public spectacle were a diagram of the social order. Where you sat told everyone else in the audience with perfect clarity exactly who you were. The path into the Senate, if you had been born a senator's son, followed a fixed sequence of offices called the cursus honorum, the course of offices, the career ladder of the Roman state. It was not optional, and it was not flexible in its order, though the minimum ages required for each office shifted somewhat across the centuries. You began with the quaestorship, a financial administrative role dealing with the treasury or with the accounts of a provincial governor, typically at around 30. From there, the path could move through the aedileship or the tribunate of the plebs, and then to the praetorship, one of the senior judicial and administrative magistracies, typically at around 40, and the summit of the cursus honorum, the office that remained the most prestigious title in the Roman political system, even when it had lost most of its real power under the emperors, was the consulship. 2 consuls elected annually in theory, appointed by the emperor in practice, and the year itself was named after them, the year of the consulship of so-and-so and so-and-so, by which all events were dated in official records. To have been consul was to have given your name to a year. It was the highest ordinary distinction a Roman citizen could hold. The system was old, the minimum ages had shifted. The reality of how offices were obtained had changed enormously from the days of the Republic to the age of the emperors. But the sequence endured because Rome loved the forms of things even when the substance had changed, and the cursus honorum preserved the appearance of a meritocratic career path up which a man climbed by demonstrated service to the state, when the reality, increasingly, was that the emperor decided who got what and when. Pliny the Younger, a real man, a real senator, writing real letters that have survived, gives us something that almost no other ancient source provides: a window into the actual, specific, financial texture of a senatorial life. Pliny owned multiple villas and estates. He wrote to friends about his properties in Tuscany and on Lake Como, describing the views, the orchards, the arrangements of the rooms, the problems with his tenant farmers. He worried in one letter about whether his tenants were falling behind on their rents, and considered whether to shift from a cash rent arrangement to payment in kind, a share of the crop, to reduce their exposure to bad harvest years and thus protect his own income stream. He recorded land prices, he discussed the management of his household. He was a man of enormous wealth by any ordinary standard, a senator who held high office and corresponded with the Emperor Trajan, and yet his letters give you the sense of a man who thought constantly and carefully about money, about how to keep his estates productive, about the vulnerability of agricultural income to weather and disease, and the decisions of tenants who were not quite reliable. Senatorial wealth was grand. It was also always slightly precarious because it was tied to land, and land did what it did regardless of your dignity or your rank. And then there was the extreme end of the scale, the men whose wealth made even a comfortable senator look modest. Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, who formed the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, whose name became so synonymous with staggering wealth that the word crass still carries a faint echo of his reputation. Plutarch's account, written long after the fact and not without its own moralizing agenda, describes Crassus as worth around 200 million sesterces at the height of his fortunes. 200 million. Against the senatorial census of 1 million, against the equestrian census of 400,000, against a soldier's 900 a year, 200 million sesterces was a number in a different category entirely, a number so large it becomes difficult to render meaningful. But Plutarch gives us the mechanism, and the mechanism is illuminating. Crassus had made much of his money in property. He owned a private fire brigade, a team of slaves trained to fight fires. And the story runs that when a building in Rome caught fire, Crassus or his representatives would appear and offer to buy the burning building and the neighboring properties at risk for a very low price from owners who were watching their wealth turn to ash and might accept almost anything. Once the purchase was agreed, the fire brigade would then act. Whether the buildings were saved or gutted depended on how quickly the owner had sold and at what price. He also drew income from silver mines and from slave trading. The fortune was assembled from diverse sources, all of them legal by Roman standards, all of them reflecting the energy and opportunism of a man who understood, in a visceral way, how Roman society translated property into power. Crassus was an extreme case, but the pattern of senatorial wealth, land, property, passive income from large-scale agriculture was universal, and it sat alongside the equestrian pattern, commerce, tax farming, finance, active management of money across the empire, in a kind of arranged division that the law enforced and the culture reinforced. The senator had the dignity and the purple stripe and the front row seat. The equestrian had the contracts and the ships and the bank accounts. Each needed the other, each resented the other sometimes, and both sat together at a vast distance above the ordinary free citizen, the freedman, and the slave. But the mechanism that connected them, the thing that made the whole structure legible and navigable, the tissue of obligation and favor and daily ritual that held Roman society together at every level, was something older than the census, older than the toga stripes, older even than the Republic itself. It was the relationship between the patron and the client. Clientela. The word gives us client directly, but in Roman usage it meant something more encompassing and more intimate than the modern word suggests. The relationship between patronus and cliens was a personal bond, a mutual obligation encoded in Roman law, embedded in Roman custom, and present in Roman daily life from the earliest period of the city's history. It was vertical. The patron was above, the client below, but it ran in both directions. The patron owed his client protection, support, legal assistance, advocacy before the courts, the kind of backing that came from having a powerful man speak for you. The client owed his patron respect, public deference, political support, and presence. Above all, presence. The great daily ritual of this relationship was the salutatio. Every morning in the houses of the wealthy and powerful across Rome and across the empire, the atrium at the entrance hall, the formal reception space, filled with people. These were the clients, the men who had come to greet their patron at the start of the day, to show themselves, to demonstrate loyalty, to ask for favors, to receive what was given. The patron would move through the atrium, receiving the greetings, hearing requests, dispensing advice, making decisions about who he would support and who he would not. It was, in modern terms, something between a job interview, a political rally, a social welfare office, and a performance of power, all condensed into the early morning hours of a Roman household. The sportula was part of it. The little basket, sportula, the diminutive of sporta, a basket, had originally been, perhaps, exactly that. A basket of food, a provision for the client's day, a practical expression of the patron's duty to support those who depended on him. By the time of the early empire, the food basket had often been commuted to a cash payment, and Martial, who wrote about the salutatio with the weariness of a man who had attended more of them than he cared to remember, gives us the number 25 asses, which works out to approximately 6 sesterces, as the going rate of the cash sportula. 6 sesterces per appearance. Enough perhaps for a decent meal, for a bit of wine, for the daily maintenance of a life that was otherwise not luxuriously funded. The client who attended the salutatio faithfully, who showed up morning after morning at the atrium, who performed the ritual of greeting and deference that the system required, received his sportula and moved on into his day. It was not a comfortable role, and the satirists never let you forget it. Martial, Juvenal, these were men who knew the salutatio from the inside, who had stood in the atrium in the early morning while Rome was still cold, and the great man was still composing himself somewhere in the interior of the house, who had waited for their turn, who had calculated whether the sportula was worth the humiliation or merely a necessary price of the life they were living. Juvenal describes the client who rushes across Rome in darkness, who bruises himself on the unlit streets, who arrives at the patron's door only to wait and waits longer, and finally receives something. The cash, or a dinner invitation, or nothing at all that day. The enormous entourage of clients that a powerful patron accumulated was, simultaneously, evidence of his power and evidence of the daily cost that power extracted from the men who constituted it. The more men who walked behind you through the streets of Rome, the more your social weight was visible to everyone who watched. And so the patron had an interest in maintaining the size of his entourage, and the clients had an interest in staying in his orbit, and the two interests locked together into a daily performance of hierarchy that was also a daily negotiation of survival. The relationship was, legally, serious. The 12 Tables, the earliest written Roman law code, dating to around 450 BC, the foundation document of Roman legal tradition, reportedly declared that a patron who defrauded his client was sesterces, accursed, set outside the protection of the law and the community. Sesterces was a powerful word. It meant devoted to the gods in a dark sense, removed from the human community, liable to be killed without the act being treated as murder. To be sesterces was to be, in the eyes of Roman law and Roman religion, no longer quite a person in the protected sense. The 12 Tables invoked this for a patron who betrayed his client. The bond was not merely customary, it was sacred, and the bond scaled. It was not only wealthy individuals who had clients, it was cities, provinces, peoples. A Roman general who conquered a region did not merely defeat it. He became its patronus in a real and lasting sense. The conquered people became clients, they owed him, and his heirs deference, support, the performance of obligation. Pompey, after his campaigns in the East, carried back to Rome a network of client relationships that spanned half the Mediterranean. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul made the Gallic tribes, in the logic of Roman social structure, something like his clients, a relationship that had implications for politics long after the fighting was over. The mechanism of clientela, designed for the streets of Rome, had expanded to encompass the world, and at the very top of the clientela pyramid, sitting at the apex of every chain of obligation in the empire, was the emperor himself. Not in name, not always. Augustus would not have said, in so many words, that he was the patron of the Roman people, in a technical legal sense. But functionally, the emperor was exactly that. He distributed grain to the city, which was the ancient generous act of a patron feeding his clients. He gave games, which was the patron's gift to the community that depended on him. He distributed money, congiaria, cash gifts to the citizens of Rome on occasions of celebration, which was the sportula writ, imperial. He heard petitions from provincials, from soldiers, from senators, from the whole enormous population of the empire that looked to him for resolution of disputes, for favor, for the protection that only the most powerful patron in the world could grant. Every client relationship in Rome was nested inside a larger one, and the largest one of all had the emperor at its head. The fisherman in Sicily, who was part of a local patron's network, who attended his own morning salutatio, who received his own small basket, even he was, at the far end of an enormously long chain, a client of the emperor. This was the architecture of Roman society, not a rigid pyramid of birthrights and frozen ranks, but a living web of obligation, constantly renegotiated, constantly performed, constantly at risk of shifting. The slave saved his peculium and watched the years pass. The freedman attended his patron's salutatio and saved whatever remained after the operae, the days of service he owed. The plebeian citizen collected his grain and his water and lived his fourth-floor life. The equestrian managed his contracts and wore his gold ring and hoped for a word from the emperor. The senator managed his estates and watched his rent rolls and performed the cursus honorum as his ancestors had performed it. And above them all, in a house on the Palatine Hill, a house that eventually became the word for all grand residences, giving us Pallas, sat the man who insisted he was not a king, only the first citizen, and who was patron to them all. But the web had a mechanism. The web had a number. And every 5 years, the census came around, and the number was checked, and the web was recalibrated, and everyone found out whether they were still standing on the rung where they had been, or whether the rung had moved. And so the moment of recalibration came, as it came every 5 years, in the form of 2 men with tablets and a very long list of questions. The censors, not censors in the modern sense, men who decide what may or may not be said. Roman censors were something older and more intimate than that. They were the keepers of the number. They were the officials, 2 of them, typically senior men who had already held the consulship, charged with walking through the entire citizen body and asking, essentially, what are you worth? What do you own? What does the state need to know about you? The census itself was older than the Republic, attributed in Roman tradition to the legendary king Servius Tullius, the 6th king of Rome, who was said to have created it not as a tool of taxation alone, but as a tool of order, a way of sorting the chaotic mass of citizens into something manageable, something ranked, something legible to the state. Whether Servius truly invented it or whether the Romans simply needed a founding story for an institution they had always had, the effect was the same. The census became the spine of Roman civic life. To be in it was to be Roman, to be left out of it, to be what the Romans called in census the uncounted, was to sit in a legal grey zone of considerable danger. Every 5 years, ideally, the censors set up their table in the Campus Martius, the great open field outside the old city walls of Rome, and every citizen was expected to appear, in person or by representative, and make a declaration. His name, his father's name, his wife, his children, his land, his livestock, his money. The whole inventory of a life sworn before the state, recorded in the rolls. What happened next with that information was the mechanism by which all the ranks we have been describing, slave, freedman, plebeian, equestrian, senator, were given their legal teeth. because the census did not merely record, it sorted. It placed each citizen into a property class, and the property class determined everything else that mattered. Your voting weight, your military obligations, and crucially, whether you sat in the equestrian centuries or the senatorial order, or whether you were simply counted with the mass of ordinary citizens. The Servian system, named for that same legendary Servius Tullius, divided the citizen body into 5 main property classes and then arranged them into voting units called centuries. The Comitia Centuriata, the Centuriate Assembly, was one of Rome's great popular institutions, the body that elected the senior magistrates and voted on war and peace. But calling it popular is where the picture requires careful adjustment, because the centuries were not equal, not remotely. The richest citizens, the first class, supplied the most centuries, the most voting units, and in any given assembly vote, the centuries voted in sequence, beginning with the first class and working downward through the property ranks. The moment any measure achieved a majority of centuries, voting stopped, which meant in practice that the votes of the poor were often never counted at all. The first class, together with a special century of cavalrymen that voted before anyone else, could frequently secure their majority before the lower classes ever cast a ballot. This is the thing about Roman democracy that tends to come as a quiet surprise. The Romans were genuinely proud of their assemblies, their elections, their elaborate voting procedures with wicker baskets and wooden bridges and tokens, and all of it was real. But the system was designed openly, without apology, so that wealth voted first and poverty waited. The property classes had constructed an institution that bore all the forms of popular participation while ensuring that the most consequential decisions tilted toward those who had the most to lose from bad governance and the most to gain from good wars. It was a democracy of property, and everyone understood the terms. At the very bottom of the Servian structure were the proletarii. The word in Latin means, in the most literal and unsparing sense, people whose only wealth is their offspring, proles, children. They had nothing else to register. And below even the proletarii were the capite censi, the counted by head, those for whom the census had nothing to measure but the bare fact of their existence. No land, no livestock, no money assessed, just a body in the count. That word, proletari, did not vanish from history when Rome fell. It traveled through the centuries, shedding its Roman specificity until a 19th century German philosopher picked it up and used it to describe the class of people who owned nothing but their own labor and their children. The word in that famous analysis came directly from the Roman census rolls. Proletariat, a category of the dispossessed, first named in the Campus Martius by Roman censors with their tablets, 25 centuries before the modern world rediscovered the need for the concept. And then there was the lustrum. Every 5 years, when the census was complete, when the last citizen had declared his last amphora of olive oil and his last field in the Campania, the censors performed a ceremony of purification. A pig, a sheep, and a bull were led in a procession around the assembled citizen army. This was the suavet aurelia, the triple sacrifice, and offered to the gods on behalf of the whole people. This closed the census and purified the citizen body together. The ceremony was called the lustrum, and the word passed into Latin and eventually into every European language as a term for a 5-year period, which is what a lustrum was, always, the breath between one reckoning and the next. What the lustrum meant in the lived experience of an ordinary Roman was that your rank was not a fixed star. It was a lamp that could be turned up or down. Between one lustrum and the next, a man might inherit land or buy it or sell it or lose it to a bad harvest or a failed business venture or a fire or a lawsuit. And at the next census, when he stood before the censors and declared his revised inventory, the number would change. And with it, potentially, his place in the centuries, his voting weight, his liability, his pride. This was the mechanism the whole structure rested on, not birth, not an immovable caste, a number, reassessed in the Campus Martius every 5 years by 2 tired senior magistrates with very long lists of questions. The number was the thing. And because the number could move, everything could move, at least in theory, at least within the limits the system imposed. Consider what that felt like on an ordinary day, not a census day, not a lustrum day, just an unremarkable morning in Rome or in any of the 100 cities that had absorbed the Roman way of living. The sun is up, and the city has already been awake for hours because Rome woke with the light and sometimes well before it. The carts that rumbled through the streets all night, the daytime ban on wheeled traffic meant that the city resupplied itself in the dark, have pulled off to the edges, and the city's 10,000 smells are beginning their daily competition. The bread from the bakeries, the garum from the market stalls, that sharp, salt-fermented fish sauce that went on everything, the way a modern kitchen might reach automatically for olive oil or soy sauce, the wood smoke, the animals, and on a table somewhere, in the back of a shop, or in a modest apartment, or in a moderately prosperous house with a small garden, breakfast. Breakfast in Rome was not elaborate. The Romans called it the ientaculum, and for most people it was light, a piece of bread, olives perhaps, some cheese, a bit of fruit if the season and the budget allowed. The Latin word for breakfast barely survived into modern languages because the meal itself barely commanded attention. It was fuel consumed quickly and then the day began. But what the day looked like depended enormously on who you were, and the distance between the breakfasts of different Romans is one of the quiet revelations of the social structure we have been tracing. At the bottom of the free ladder, the plebeian citizen in his 4th-floor insular apartment, the freedman still building his savings, the day labourer who worked for wages and collected his grain dole. The diet ran along a narrow band. Wheat, in some form, was almost always the centre of it. The oldest Roman staple was not bread but pulse, a thick porridge or gruel made from emmer wheat or spelt, cooked until it was soft and eaten with whatever small additions were available. Pulse was ancient, humble, and sustaining. The Romans of a later, more sophisticated era sometimes looked back at pulse eating as a sign of ancestral simplicity and virtue. Their ancestors had not needed sauces and silver platters, they had eaten their porridge and built an empire. But for the poor of the actual city, pulse or bread made from cheap grain was not nostalgia. It was Tuesday. It was every day. Around the bread and the pulse, legumes, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans. Olives, both for eating and for the oil that went into cooking, into lamps, onto skin after bathing. Cheap vegetables from the market. And then, adding its salt-sharp edge to all of it, garum. Garum deserves a moment because it ran through Roman cooking the way salt runs through everything, omnipresently at every social level, produced in industrial quantities in factories that have been excavated at Pompeii and along the Spanish coast. Garum was fermented fish sauce made by layering fish and salt and letting time and bacteria do the rest. The result, after weeks or months, was a dark, intensely savoury liquid that the Romans put on nearly everything. On bread, on meat when they had it, on vegetables, in sauces, in the recipes that survive in the cookbook attributed to Apicius. There were grades of garum, as there are grades of anything produced in quantity. Cheap garum for the poor, premium garum, made from high-quality fish by careful producers in the best facilities, for those who could pay for it. The condiment itself crossed every class line. The quality of it was where the line was drawn. Meat was a luxury for the poor, and for most of Roman history it came reliably to ordinary people, mainly through the public sacrifices, the great temple rituals where animals were killed before the gods and the flesh distributed. A sacrifice was also, in a very practical sense, a distribution of protein. The gods received the smoke and the organs, the people received the rest. On festival days, meat was available in a way it was not on ordinary ones. Wine, too, was drunk at every level, but not the same wine. The Romans believed that drinking wine undiluted was something only barbarians did. Civilized people cut their wine with water in varying proportions, and the word for drinking it neat carried a moral charge that had nothing to do with sobriety and everything to do with self-control. For the poor, the drink of choice was posca, which was wine so far along toward vinegar that calling it wine was almost charitable, a sharp, sour mix of cheap wine vinegar and water that quenched thirst and provided whatever thin nutrition the fermentation process had left behind. Posca was also, it is worth noting, the standard drink of Roman soldiers on campaign. The men who built the empire drank the same tart, acidic mixture as the poorest people in its cities. And then there was the other table, the one on the Palatine in the Esquiline villa, in the dining room of the senator or the wealthy equestrian, where the evening meal was not an afterthought but an event. The triclinium. 3 couches arranged on 3 sides of a central table, each couch holding up to 3 reclining guests. The Romans ate the cena, the main meal of the day, in the afternoon or evening, reclining, propped on the left elbow, eating with the right hand, the food brought by slaves in the elaborate choreography of a proper Roman household. The cena could be simple, or it could be the kind of event that lasted hours and moved through course after course, from the gustatia and the appetizers, eggs and olives and small salted things, through the main courses to the desserts, all accompanied by wine in quantities that varied by the restraint of the host. A convivium, a dinner party, a feast, was one of the primary arenas of status display in Roman life. The food announced you, the guests announced you, the silverware, the quality of the lamps, the skill of the cook, the variety and exoticism of the dishes. All of it was read by your guests as a statement of where you stood, and you knew they were reading it, and you composed the meal accordingly. The cookbook associated with a man named Apicius, De Re Coquinaria, preserved in manuscripts and still partially legible today, gives us a window into the haute cuisine of the Roman elite that is simultaneously familiar and vertiginously strange. There are sauces, there are roasted meats with elaborate spiced reductions. There are preparations that would not be out of place in any restaurant that takes itself seriously. And then there are the dormice, the glyas. Edible dormice, small creatures that were fattened in special ceramic jars. The Romans actually made purpose-built containers for this called gliraria, fed on nuts and acorns until they were as large and rich as the enclosure could make them, and then served, often honeyed, often roasted, as a delicacy. They appear in Petronius and Pliny and in Apicius, and their presence on the table was a signal, a quiet, small, expensive signal, that this household had the means and the inclination to import a luxury that most Romans would never see on their plate. There were also flamingo tongues and the shells of peacock eggs and all manner of extravagance, not because the Roman rich were uniquely strange in their tastes, but because extravagance at table is one of the most ancient and reliable ways that every society that has ever produced a surplus has chosen to display the fact. The ordinary citizen, meanwhile, had no kitchen. The insular apartments that housed the bulk of Rome's urban population had no safe place to cook. Open flames in a building made of wood and packed tightly against other buildings of wood were simply too dangerous, which is why Rome burned as often as it did. So the ordinary Roman went out to eat. The thermopolium, the hot food counter built into the street front of a shop with its L-shaped masonry counter and its sunken ceramic dolia holding warm food through the day, was where most urban Romans ate their hot meals. Dozens of these counters have been excavated at Pompeii, their countertops still scarred by the pots, their walls still carrying painted menus in some cases. You walked up, you pointed, you paid a few coins, you ate standing or at one of the rough tables nearby. It was fast and it was cheap and it was the default mode of dining for most of the city. The distance between the glyers in their honey sauce on a senator's triclinium table and the bowl of lentil stew at a Pompeian thermopolium is not just a distance in food. It is the distance between the whole systems of living we have been traversing. The insula and the villa, the dolia and the silver plate, the posca and the Falernian wine. And it is a distance that could be measured if you insisted on measuring it in sesterces. Now to the question of climbing or falling. The ladder existed, the mechanism existed, the number, the census valuation moved. But movement was not free, and the climb, especially the climb toward the top, carried costs that could be ruinous, and the Roman political system had spent centuries producing extraordinarily specific rules about exactly how ruinous those costs were allowed to be. To seek political office in Rome was to enter an economy of display that had no clean floor. The word we still use, candidate, comes directly from the Roman practice. A man seeking office wore a toga, treated with chalk to make it blindingly white, the toga candida, the white toga, so that he would stand out in the forum, literally luminous with ambition, impossible to overlook, as he pressed flesh and sought votes. Candidatus, the man in the white toga, candidate. And the white toga was only the beginning of the expense. Roman elections, for all their formal solemnity, operated in an atmosphere thick with gift-giving, which everyone understood and which the law periodically tried to address. The practice was called ambitus, from the Latin for going around, which is what candidates did, going around and distributing their generosity. Feasts for voters. Games for the public. Wine, money, and the subtler lubricants of connection and favor. In 63 BC, the consul Cicero passed the Lex Tullia de Ambitu, one of the many Roman laws against electoral bribery, which demonstrates, as all such laws demonstrate, precisely how widespread the behavior was. Laws against a thing are the surest evidence that the thing was happening. But it was the aedileship that could truly break a man. The aediles were magistrates responsible for the city, the markets, the streets, the water supply, the maintenance of public buildings, and, most importantly, the ludi, the public games. The games were not a side project of the aedileship. They were its central performance, the thing by which an aedile was judged and by which he built the political capital he would need for the higher offices to follow. And staging games cost money on a scale that defies easy translation. In 65 BC, a man not yet famous, but clearly determined to become so, Gaius Julius Caesar, served as aedile. And Caesar spent. He staged games of such extravagance with so many gladiators, such elaborate spectacle, that the Senate, alarmed at the implicit display of power, actually passed a law limiting the number of gladiators a single person could bring to Rome. Caesar had planned for more. He had borrowed money, enormous sums, mostly from the extraordinarily wealthy Marcus Crassus, who saw in Caesar's ambition a useful investment, to fund a display that would make Rome remember his name. And it worked, in the way such things worked in Rome. The crowds loved it, the popular support accumulated, and Caesar emerged from the aedileship politically fortified and financially devastated, carrying debts that would have crushed most men and that he spent the next years of his career working to repay. The cost of climbing in the most concrete, imaginable terms. A man could also fall out of his order, fall below the threshold, find at the next census that the number was now wrong, too small, disqualifyingly small. A senator who had somehow spent or lost or been stripped of enough of his fortune that his declared wealth no longer reached the 1,000,000 sesterce mark of the senatorial order faced the humiliation of being dropped from the rolls. Not imprisoned, not executed, not formally punished, simply reclassified, no longer a senator. The latus clavus stripped from his tunic, the calce senatori replaced by ordinary shoes, the front seats at the games surrendered. And this is where the emperor's reach extended downward in a way that is not always noticed, because the emperors, beginning with Augustus, sometimes intervened. A senator whose finances had collapsed, who sat before the census, near but not quite at the million mark, might find that the emperor quietly supplied the gap. A personal transfer, a discreet arrangement through the imperial household's vast financial machinery that brought the humiliated senator back to his threshold and allowed him to retain his rank. Augustus did this. Later emperors did it too. The reasons were partly social. A senate that visibly lost members to poverty was a senate whose dignity was diminished, and the senate's dignity was, in a complicated way, part of the emperor's own stage set. And they were partly political. A senator who owed his rank to the emperor's private generosity was a senator whose gratitude was assured and whose independence was compromised. The subsidy was never entirely free. The same logic applied, in subtler form, to the equestrian order and to the grants of rank that the emperor could make directly. The adlectio into the Senate, the grant of the latus clavus, to a promising young man whose father had been equestrian and whose son would perhaps be consular. The emperor sat at the top of the census system not only because his own wealth was beyond any threshold, but because he had the power to move the threshold's application for individuals, to lift or lower the bar case by case as political necessity suggested. And there was another ladder within the climb that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with cloth. The toga was not one garment, it was a system, and every variation within the system was a message that Romans could read at a glance, the way any society reads uniforms. The toga virilis, the toga of manhood, was the plain white wool garment given to a Roman boy when he came of age, around 16, on a spring day at the Liberalia festival, and it marked him as a citizen with the full weight of that citizenship beginning to settle on his shoulders. The toga praetexta, the toga with the purple border, was worn by magistrates in office and by freeborn boys before they came of age, two groups connected by the fact that both were under the protection of a higher authority. The state in the case of the magistrate, the father in the case of the child. The toga candida, the whitened toga, we have already met on the streets of the Forum, announcing a candidate's ambition to anyone within sight. And at the apex of the toga hierarchy sat the toga picta, the painted toga, fully purple, embroidered in gold, which was worn by a general on the day of his triumph, by an emperor in moments of supreme ceremony. The toga picta was so saturated with meaning that even the emperor did not wear it every day. It was the garment of the absolute occasion, the color of authority taken to its furthest point. Purple, throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, was expensive in a way that no modern reproduction quite captures because modern dye is made in factories. Roman purple, Tyrian purple, came from the murex sea snail, extracted gland by gland in a process so labor-intensive and so smelly that the factories that produced it were placed well downwind of any city worth living in. The result, after all that effort, was a dye that did not fade, that grew more vivid with sun and salt water rather than less. A small quantity of that dye represented an enormous expenditure of labor and material. A toga entirely saturated in it was a garment that announced without words that its wearer commanded resources beyond ordinary imagining. Cloth as census. Cloth as number made visible, draped around a body, and paraded through the forum for everyone to read correctly, which they did because everyone in that world had learned to read it. And then there was the man who wore the most cloth of all, who stood at the top of the longest ladder in the world, who was patron to 100 million clients, and who, this is the remarkable thing, insisted he was not a king. Augustus. The name itself is not a name but a title granted to the man born Gaius Octavius by the Senate in January of 27 BC. Before the Senate gave him Augustus, a word carrying the weight of the sacred, the revered, the majestic, he had been known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He became, after 27 BC, simply Augustus, and every man who held supreme power after him became Augustus too, the word shedding its particularity and becoming a title the way Caesar had become a title, so that by later centuries every emperor was both a Caesar and an Augustus, regardless of what family he had been born into. But he refused to be Rex. This refusal was not modesty. It was the most carefully calculated political gesture in Roman history, because Rex, king, was the word that had ended the Roman monarchy in 509 BC, when the kings were expelled and the Republic was born. And the hatred for the concept had not dimmed in the 5 centuries since. Julius Caesar, Augustus's adoptive father, had been assassinated in part because his enemies feared, or claimed to fear, that he wanted to be called king. The conspirators on the Ides of March had wrapped their daggers in the language of republican virtue, the defense of the Senate and the people against the tyranny of one man. Whether Caesar had actually wanted the title of Rex is disputed by historians, and was disputed in his own time. What is not disputed is that the title killed him, or at least gave the killing its justification. Augustus learned from this with the precision of a man who had survived a civil war by learning quickly. He accepted no throne, wore no crown, took no title that the Romans had explicitly rejected. Instead, he accumulated powers, the imperium, the military command, the legal authority of a supreme general, extended and renewed by the Senate, and covering not just armies in the field, but the entire governance of the provinces that required legions. The tribunicia potestas, the powers of the tribune of the people, gave him the sacrosanctity, the legal inviolability that had once protected the tribunes from physical harm, and the veto over all legislation, and the ability to convene the people. He was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, the holder of the greatest religious office in the city, a role so entangled with civic identity that it would be held by every subsequent emperor until the Christian era, and whose title would survive into the present day in a very different religious context. He called himself Princeps, first citizen. The word was old. It had been used for respected senior senators, men of long experience whose opinion carried natural weight in debate. By calling himself simply the most respected of the senators, Augustus was claiming a position within the Republic's own vocabulary rather than above it. The system he created was called the Principate for this reason, and it was, in the most literal sense, a very elegant fiction. Everyone understood that the man with the armies, the treasury, the veto, and the sacred inviolability was not merely the most respected senator in the room, but the fiction that he was allowed the Romans to feel that their republic still existed, that the Senate still mattered, that the offices still conferred real dignity, and it allowed Augustus to present himself not as the conqueror of the old order, but as its restoration. The power to make someone a god did not escape the irony of its own implications. After an emperor died, assuming he had not been too catastrophically disgraced to be commemorated, the Senate voted on whether to deify him. Apotheosis, the elevation to divine status, the declaration that this man was now divus, divine, and would have his own temples and priests. Most emperors received it. A few were denied it in the posthumous dishonor called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, by which an emperor's name might be chiseled from inscriptions and his statues smashed. But those who were deified joined a growing catalogue of official Roman gods who had once been men: Julius Caesar, Augustus himself, Claudius, and many more, which created the strange situation of a state that was simultaneously practicing polytheism, imperial cult, and a kind of institutionalized ancestor worship all at once. The Emperor Vespasian, who came to power after a bloody civil war and ruled with considerable practical sense, was reputed to have made a joke on his deathbed in AD 79. Feeling himself slipping away, he is supposed to have said, with characteristic bluntness, "Vai, puto Deus fio." "Oh dear, I think I am becoming a god." Suetonius records it, which means we receive it filtered through a biographer writing after the fact, but whether or not Vespasian actually said it, the Romans remembered it as exactly the kind of thing Vespasian would have said. A man practical enough to understand that the machinery of divine elevation was a political tool, and self-aware enough to find that slightly absurd. The emperor's wealth, his patrimonium, his fiscus, the treasury that was technically his personal property, and the treasury of the state, which had become so entangled by the time of the early empire that separating them was largely theoretical, was beyond the census in the way that the sun is beyond measurement by a kitchen thermometer. The scale simply exceeded the instrument. Estates, mines, quarries, whole provinces generating their tax revenues, the accumulated inheritances of the imperial family, the voluntary and involuntary donations of 100 million subjects across 3 continents. No censor sat Augustus down in the Campus Martius and asked him to declare his property classes. He was the census, and yet, and this is the final thing, the thing that holds the whole picture together, the emperor sat atop the patronage system, not outside it. He was the greatest patron in a world built on patronage. He had clients the way a mountain has lower slopes. The senators were his clients, and the equestrians were clients of senators, and also, through the imperial bureaucracy, directly of the emperor, and the freedmen of the imperial household were his in the most intimate sense, and the whole citizen body was his plebs, the plebs that had always sought bread and games and the security of a powerful patron's protection. The chain ran all the way down, from the man who wore the toga picta to the man who paid his 2 copper coins at the Thermopolium counter for a bowl of lentils and looked up at the sky, which was the same sky. And now, to like in 212 AD, 3 centuries after Augustus refused the crown in the Campus Martius, the man on the throne was Caracalla, and he extended something. The Constitutio Antoniniana, an edict of extraordinary reach, granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. Every free person in Britain, in Egypt, in Syria, in Gaul, in the Danubian provinces, if they were not a slave, they were, from that moment, Roman citizens. The dole was available. The census applied. The tria nomina, the 3 names of the Roman citizen, became in principle the names of millions who had spent their entire lives being governed by Rome without being of it. Why did Caracalla do it? The historians then and now have disagreed. Some said it was to extend the inheritance tax. Citizens paid a tax on inheritances that non-citizens did not, and a vastly expanded citizen body meant a vastly expanded tax base. Cynical, if true. Others suggested it was a genuine universalism, an acknowledgement that the empire had long since outgrown the city on the Tiber and become something larger than any ethnicity or origin could contain. Probably it was both, and more besides, because large political acts rarely have a single clean motive. But the effect was this. The base of the ladder was widened enormously. The bottom rung, which had once required birth in Italy, or the slow accumulation of Latin rights and provincial grants of citizenship across generations. That rung was now available to almost everyone who was free. The bottom of the ladder was not the top of it. The census thresholds for the equestrian and senatorial orders did not change. The mechanisms of patronage and obligation did not dissolve. The toga codes did not simplify, but the foundation, the minimum condition of being inside the system rather than outside it, was extended across almost the entire inhabited Roman world. It was not equality, it was a widening, and a widening in a world where the alternative was having no rung at all was significant. So, let us pull back now. Let us rise from the specific, the peculium saved coin by coin, the census tablet in the censor's hands, the chalk-whitened toga of the candidate, the honeyed dormouse on the silver plate, the joke about becoming a god, and look at the shape of the whole thing. What Rome built was not the frozen pyramid that the simple diagram suggests. It was a mechanism. It was a social machine of extraordinary complexity that ran on numbers and ceremonies and obligations and cloth. A slave could accumulate a peculium and purchase his freedom, or wait for it in the master's will and walk out of the ceremony of the vindictor, wearing a felt cap and carrying a citizen's name and a citizen's rights. His children would be freeborn, ingenui, carrying none of his former stain. His former master would be his patron, and he would owe obsequium and operae and the deference of a client. But he would owe it as a free man. A freedman could grow extraordinarily wealthy, as Pallas grew wealthy, as Narcissus grew wealthy, as the grotesque and magnificent fictional Trimalchio grew wealthy in Petronius's imagination, because commerce did not care about the macula servitutis the way the magistracies did. An equestrian could be elected into the Senate if his wealth reached the right number and the emperor's eye fell on him favorably. A senator could lose everything and fall below his threshold and find himself reclassified by the censors, or find the emperor quietly filling the gap for his own reasons. And the proletarii, the capite censi, the people at the bottom of the census with nothing to declare but themselves, they had the grain dole and the games and the insula and the thermopolium and the noise of the city and the modest, daily accumulated dignity of being counted, of being in the rolls, of being, in some minimal but real sense, Roman. That was the thing the census gave even the poorest citizen that no wealth could give a slave, the count. To be in census, uncounted, was to be outside the protection of law and civic identity alike. To be in the census, even at the capite censi level, was to be inside the architecture, however low your floor. And the emperor, the man at the apex, the man who wore the purple, who held the imperium and the tribunitia potestas and the office of Pontifex Maximus, who was addressed as Augustus and would be declared divus after his death. Even he was embedded in the same logic. His power rested on the Senate's recognition, on the army's loyalty, which was itself a client relationship written in gold and silver donatives, on the grain supply and the games that kept the city's millions fed and distracted and attached to the system rather than violently opposed to it. He was the patron of the whole, but a patron is only a patron because he has clients, and clients have to believe. The relationship serves them, or they leave. And when the clients of an emperor left in earnest, they usually did it with swords. The whole system was, in the end, a set of mutual dependencies dressed in the language of natural order. The slave needed the master's permission, and the master needed the slave's labor. The freedman needed the patron's protection, and the patron needed the freedman's loyalty and services. The client needed the sportula and the legal backing, and the patron needed the crowd of clients to walk behind him through the forum, measuring his importance in bodies. The senator needed the tenant farmers on his estates, and the tenant farmers needed the land the senator owned. The equestrian needed the provincial tax contracts, and the provincial populations needed someone to negotiate the taxes rather than simply losing their property outright. And the emperor needed all of it running smoothly, the whole intricate web of obligation that was Roman society, because the empire did not run on laws alone. It ran on relationships, vertical, personal, ancient, carefully maintained relationships in which everyone from the highest senator to the humblest client understood their place and their obligations and the exact number in sesterces that described where they stood. That number could change. That is the thing to carry away into the quiet. The number could change, and in the 5 years between lustra, a great deal of life was available for the living, whether you were saving your peculium copper by copper, or managing the rent rolls of your Campanian estates, or waiting in the cold morning air of the atrium for the patron's door to open and the sportula to arrive. The Roman world was loud and crowded and smelled of garum and wood smoke and the animals in the market. It was dangerous in the ways that dense cities are always dangerous, and its social machinery was often cruel in the ways that systems built on slavery are always cruel. But it was also, in its way, alive or intimate with the daily transaction of obligation and exchange, with the particular energy of a civilization that had found a way to turn rank itself into a commodity, to set a price on precedence and collect it in a currency that every 5 years the census came to count. Somewhere tonight, in all the noise of the world as it now is, you are lying down to rest. And the Roman world we have been walking through together, from the slave with his peculium to the emperor with his fiction of first citizenship, is very old and very quiet, and most of it is underground, which is where old things eventually go. But some of it is still here, in words we use without knowing where they came from. Candidate, from the white toga. Proletariat, from the census column that counted the childful and propertyless poor. Lustrum, from the closing ceremony of the great 5-year count. Pallas, from the Palatine hill where the emperor lived. Even the felt cap of the freed slave traveled through centuries of iconography to become the liberty cap of revolutions, perched on the heads of people fighting for freedom in countries the Romans never heard of, which tells you something about how far a symbol can travel when it carries the right weight. The census is taken, the lustrum is performed, the pig and the sheep and the bull have been led around the field in the old ceremony, and the purification is complete, and everyone has been counted, and the numbers are in the rolls, and for the next 5 years, whatever those years bring, harvest or drought, war or peace, the slow accumulation of a peculium or the sudden collapse of an estate, those are the numbers that will govern. If you are listening from somewhere in the world tonight, I would genuinely like to know where. The comments are there, and I read them. And the geography of where these slow journeys find their listeners is something I think about more than you might expect. There are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind, waiting for whenever you want them. You have done enough for one day, whatever remained of it when you pressed play. Set it down now. The Roman census is complete, the lustrum is closed, and the world you carry has been counted and can rest. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.